The rice on Naomi Danso's plate had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and she still had not taken a second bite. 30 guests. 2 long tables draped in white linen. Somewhere behind her a string quartet kept playing, as if the air in the room had not just changed. Miho Han set down her chopsticks the way she did everything, without a sound. She looked at Naomi the way a woman looks at a stain she has decided not to mention until the company has gone home. Except tonight she decided not to wait. "You fat ass," she said, in a voice so calm it took the room a full second to understand what it had heard. "Will never be accepted into our family." No one moved. Near the kitchen door, a server froze mid-step with a tray of tea balanced on one hand. Naomi felt her own heartbeat arrive in her ears, the particular silence of 30 people deciding, all at once, not to be the one who speaks first. She had promised herself she would not cry in this house. She kept that promise. Barely. Then the door at the end of the hall opened. It was not supposed to open for another 20 minutes. Miho Han walked in wearing the kind of stillness that made the string quartet lose the thread of the song they were playing. He did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. He looked at his mother for exactly 1 second, and then he looked at Naomi, and something moved across his face that made 30 people in that room understand, all at once, that whatever happened next would not be undone. Before we go any further, let me say this quietly because I want to say it as gently as I mean it. If this is your first time here, welcome to Afro-Korean Stories Empire. This is where we tell the love stories that do not announce themselves loudly at first. The ones that start in rooms exactly like this one, in silence exactly like this one, and in somewhere neither of you will forget. If you have ever been looked at and found wanting by someone whose approval you did not even know you were still waiting for, stay with me. Subscribe if you feel like it, so you never miss the next one of these. But right now, stay in this room with Naomi. That door is still open. Miho crossed the room the unhurried way he always moved, the way that made other men adjust their posture without knowing why they had done it. He reached the head of the table, rested one hand briefly on the back of Naomi's chair, and looked at his mother. "Say that again," he said. "I want to be sure I heard you." Sunny did not flinch. She had spent 30 years learning not to. But something behind her eyes recalculated quickly, the way it does when a person realizes the ground they were standing on was never as solid as they believed. To understand what happens next, you need to understand how we got here. So let us go back, 4 years back, to a rainy Tuesday in a market that smelled like wet concrete and ginger, before either of them had any idea what the other one was. Naomi Danso was 32 the night of that dinner, but this story begins 4 years earlier than that. She grew up in Kumasi, the oldest of 5 children, and when her father died, she was 11 years old and became, without ever being asked, the one who carried things. Market bags balanced on her head. Younger siblings settled on her hip. A family's fear held quietly, so no one else had to hold it. She came to Seoul on a scholarship to study supply chains and stayed to build something of her own, a small textile import business run out of a rented storeroom that always smelled faintly of cardboard and dye. She wore her father's cowrie shell bracelet every day without exception, and she had a laugh, the real one, not the careful smile she gave to strangers deciding whether she belonged in a room, a laugh that came out so rarely her best friend used to count out loud just to embarrass her into doing it more. Miho Han was 34 the year this story really begins. To most of Seoul, he was simply the man who ran the Han family's interests, shipping routes, property holdings, a name said carefully in some rooms and not at all in others. What almost no one knew was that he had been 19 years old the night his father was killed by a man his father had trusted like a brother, close enough in the room that he could still, 15 years later, describe the exact smell of his father's cologne in the seconds before it happened. His mother did not let him grieve as a son. Within the month, she had begun training him to understand that the men who survive in this world are the ones nobody can read, and that wanting something out loud is the same as pointing at it for someone else to take. So Miho learned stillness the way other men learn trade. Nobody in his world had witnessed, not once in 15 years, the version of him that noticed small things and kept them and never once needed to announce that he had. Hold on to both of them. Because everything that happens in that dining room happens because of who each of these 2 people had already quietly decided to become long before Naomi ever set foot in that house. Naomi Sunday calls home always went the same way. Her mother would ask if she was eating well, and Naomi would say yes, even on the Sundays when dinner was instant noodles eaten standing over the sink, because sitting down felt like admitting how tired she was. Her mother would ask if Sol was treating her fairly, and Naomi would say people here were kind, mostly because there was no version of the truth that could cross an ocean without becoming a worry her mother carried alone at night. Ifia, her roommate, used to sit on the counter listening to these calls and shake her head afterward. "You lied to that woman with your whole chest," she would say. Naomi would just shrug. Some weights, she had learned a long time ago, were hers to carry, so nobody else had to. That particular Tuesday, the rain had been coming down since morning. Naomi was alone in her storeroom, counting bolts of Kent cloth against an invoice, when the door opened without a knock. The man who walked in was heavy-set, a market fixture everyone called Mr. O, and he smiled the way men smile when they are about to ask you for something you do not owe them. Protection money. He called it, lightly, like weather, a monthly fee for foreign shop owners who wanted their shipments to keep arriving without complications. Naomi kept her spine straight and her voice level and told him she would think about it, because she had learned that fear shown to a man like this becomes a tool he uses against you. Inside, her heart was doing the math it always did in these moments. How many months of rent were left if this went wrong? How many siblings back home were waiting on shipments that had not even left the warehouse yet? She was still holding that calm, careful face when the door opened a second time. The man who walked in this time was dressed like nothing at all. A dark coat, no watch worth noticing, the kind of unremarkable that Naomi would only later understand was deliberate. He did not look at her first. He looked at Mr. O, and something happened to Mr. O's face that Naomi had never seen happen to a grown man before. All the confidence went out of it at once, like a light switched off in another room. Mr. O said one word. A name. Han. He apologized to a spot on the floor somewhere between his own shoes and the door. And then he was gone, and the room was very quiet, and the rain was louder against the tin roof than it had been a minute before. The man in the dark coat looked at Naomi properly for the first time. His eyes moved once around the room. The bolts of fabric, the invoice in her hand, the small tremor she was already trying to smooth out of her fingers. He did not ask if she was all right in the way people ask when they want you to perform gratitude for them. He simply said he will not come back. She wanted to ask how he could know that with such certainty. What came out instead was smaller. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, the smallest possible amount of nodding a person can do and still call a nod, and his eyes caught on her wrist for half a second before he looked away. Her father's bracelet. She would not learn until much later that he had noticed it at all, let alone that he remembered it. Then he was gone, out into the rain, and Naomi stood alone in her storeroom with her heart still going too fast, holding an invoice she had stopped reading, thinking about a stranger's voice that had never once risen and had somehow ended a threat faster than shouting ever could have. That was the first time. It would not be the last. Now, 3 days after that rainy Tuesday, in an office on the 14th floor of a shipping building Naomi had never heard of, something else was happening, something she would never know about, though it was already, in its own quiet way, about her. A logistics manager named Jae-hoon sat across a wide teak desk from Miho, explaining, in the careful voice of a man who has rehearsed his own innocence in a mirror, why the margins on 3 consecutive shipments through the community import routes had come up short. He used words like miscalculation. He used words like vendor error. Miho listened to all of it without interrupting a single sentence, his hands folded on the desk, a cup of barley tea cooling untouched at his elbow. When Jae-hoon finished, Miho did not respond right away. He picked up the tea and finished it, unhurried, the way a man finishes something he has all the time in the world to enjoy. Then he set the empty cup down without a sound. "Give me your watch," he said. Jae-hoon blinked. It was, of everything he might have expected in that room, the one thing he had not prepared for. He unclasped it slowly, a gift from his wife, and placed it on the desk between them. "You have until sunrise to be outside the city limits," Miho said. His voice had not changed pitch once through the entire conversation. "Not tomorrow. Sunrise." Jae-hoon opened his mouth to argue, to explain again, to find some new configuration of words that might undo what had just been decided. Nothing came out. He understood, the way men in that building always eventually understood, that the decision had already been made several sentences ago, and that everything since had simply been Miho being patient enough to let him finish talking. He was gone before the second cup of tea Miho poured himself had gone cold. This was, we should say plainly, who Miho Han actually was. Not a rumor. Not a story told by men trying to sound important at a bar. A fact delivered quietly, in a room that smelled of nothing, by a man who would, within the year, learn to loosen his tie the moment he was alone with a woman who did not yet know any of this about him. Over the following months, Naomi's storeroom did unusually, suspiciously well. A customs delay that should have taken 3 weeks resolved itself in 4 days. A rival importer who had been undercutting her prices suddenly, quietly, stopped. She noticed these things the way you notice good weather, gratefully, without asking too many questions about where it came from. She also noticed that the man from the rainy Tuesday kept appearing at the edges of her life in ways that felt, at the time, like nothing more than a small city being smaller than it seemed. He was at the coffee stand 2 stalls down more mornings than felt like chance. He was at the market association meeting she almost skipped. Once, she caught him watching her negotiate a price with a fabric wholesaler from across the aisle, and when their eyes met, he did not look away first. She did. She learned his name properly the 3rd time they spoke. Miho. He said it the way he said everything, briefly, like a man who had learned that words cost something and should not be spent carelessly. She found herself, against every instinct that had kept her safe and unbothered for 4 years in this city, thinking about him on the walk home. Not because he had done anything, because of how carefully he had not. 6 weeks after that, on a rooftop terrace above a restaurant Naomi had never heard of, a mid-tier associate named Minjun had had 1 drink too many. He was talking to 2 other men about a woman he had seen at the market recently, a big one, he said, using a word that made the men beside him laugh, the uneasy laugh men give when they are not actually sure a joke is safe yet. He did not know Miho was seated 4 tables away. He did not know Miho had heard every word. Miho did not raise his voice. He rose from his seat, unhurried, crossed the terrace, and sat down directly across from Minjun, close enough that the younger man's laughter died somewhere in his throat before he understood why. Say her name again, Miho said, pleasant, almost friendly. The one you were just describing. Minjun did not know it. That was the problem. He had never bothered to learn it. Do you know whose table you were sitting at when you say things like that? Miho asked. It was not really a question. He reached across the table and took Minjun's right hand in both of his own, the way you might take the hand of someone you were about to help up from a fall. Then, with no more urgency than a man folding a napkin, he broke 2 of Minjun's fingers, one after the other. The sound was small, almost polite. Minjun did not scream, though every part of his face wanted to. Screaming, in that world, in front of those men, would have been its own kind of ending. Miho let go of his hand gently, the way you set down something you're finished with, and stood. Learn her name, he said, or do not speak about her again. He returned to his own table and finished his drink. The conversation around him continued as though nothing at all had happened, because in that world, for those men, nothing unusual had. Naomi never learned this had occurred. Not that night. Not for a long time after. But something in her had already, without her permission, begun to trust the quiet man from the market more than she trusted most people who spoke loudly and often. The rain came back into her life on a Thursday, 4 months after the first time. Her largest shipment of the year, 6 months of careful ordering, most of her savings, had been flagged and held at customs over a paperwork discrepancy that made no sense to anyone she called. She stood outside the customs office in a downpour that had started without warning, watching the awning drip onto her shoes, doing the math again, the same math she always did, and coming up short in every version of it. Miho arrived without her calling him. She would not learn until much later that he had known about the hold before she did. He did not make a scene inside the office. He said perhaps 11 words to a supervisor who suddenly remembered exactly where Naomi's paperwork was. He came back out into the rain, where she was still standing, and he did not say anything about what he had done, did not offer up the way people offer up kindness when they want credit for it. They stood together under the narrow awning while the rain thickened, and there was not quite enough room for both of them to stay dry. Without a word, he shifted the umbrella he had been carrying, angling it to cover the exposed side of her shoulder, leaving his own sleeve open to the rain. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them moved apart. Naomi looked up at him, at the water beginning to darken the shoulder of his coat, and something in her chest did a thing she had not let it do in a very long time. He looked back at her, and for exactly 1 second longer than the moment required, neither of them looked away. It was such a small thing, a man tilting an umbrella. But Naomi would think about that 1 extra second for the rest of her life. The way you think about the precise moment a door you did not know was closed quietly begins to open. Somewhere across the city that same week, Miho Han, who had already met Naomi once in passing and thought nothing of it at the time, was hearing whispers that her son had a woman he visited too regularly for it to be nothing. Sunny filed the information away the way she filed everything that frightened her. Quietly, without comment. For now, the months after the rain moved differently than the months before it. There were dinners that were not business, though he called them that at first out of habit. There was a night she made him jollof rice in her small apartment and watched, astonished, as a man who negotiated the fate of entire shipping routes without changing expression closed his eyes at the first bite like something in him had been waiting years for exactly that flavor. There was a night, much later, when she finally asked him what his family actually did, and he answered her with 3 careful sentences that were true without being complete, and she let them be enough because some part of her had already decided she would rather have careful truth from him than easy lies from anyone else. She did not yet know about Jae-hoon. She did not know about Minjun's hand. She knew only that when she was afraid of something, it tended, quietly and without explanation, to stop being frightening. She told herself this was simply luck. She was beginning, in the small hours when she let herself be honest, to suspect it was not. Before we go further, can I ask you to do something small? If this story has already gotten under your skin the way I suspect it has, pause here for 1 second. Tap that subscribe button if you're feeling what I think you're feeling right now. Send this to the one person you know who would feel this too, a sister, a best friend, someone who's been waiting a long time for a love that finds its way through impossible things. And if you're still here with me, type I am enjoying IT in the comments, so I know you made it this far with Naomi and Miho. Thank you for staying. Now let us go back in, because everything you thought you understood about how these two people found each other is about to look different. Here is what Naomi did not know, and what you, now, are finally allowed to know. The customs hold on her shipment had not been a paperwork error. It had never been random. A local collector operating in Miho's territory had spent months quietly extorting foreign shop owners, Naomi's storeroom among them, threatening shipments, threatening leases, threatening the fragile permission these business owners needed to keep existing in a city that had never fully decided to welcome them. Miho had ended that operation 2 months before the rainy Thursday at customs, methodically, without a single visible trace back to him. He had also, and this is the part that matters, made certain he was the one standing in that customs office the day her shipment happened to stall on an unrelated technicality, because by then he had stopped needing an excuse to see her and had started needing a reason he could admit to himself. And Jae-hoon, the logistics manager sent out of the city at sunrise, had not simply been skimming margins for his own comfort. He had been feeding shipment schedules to the very collector network, threatening Naomi's storeroom, trading information for a cut of the extortion. The audit that looked from the outside like routine business discipline had been, from its very first quiet sentence, about protecting a woman who did not yet know she was under anyone's protection at all. Every coincidence had been a choice. Every accident had been devotion wearing a disguise it could not yet afford to remove. For a while, it seemed as though the hardest part might already be behind them. Sunny invited Naomi to tea. Alone. It was by every measure Naomi understood, an enormous door opening. Sunny spoke, for the first time, about her own early years in this family, arriving at 22 with an accent the old soul families had mocked behind her back for a decade before they stopped doing it to her face. She gave Naomi a small woven bracelet she had made with her own hands as a young woman, decades old, kept in a drawer Naomi would later learn had not been opened for anyone in a very long time. Naomi walked home that evening lighter than she had felt in months, certain, for the first time, that this family might actually have room for her in it. She did not know that on the very same afternoon, in a different part of the city, Sang-go Han was sitting across from 3 elders of the family council, quietly informing them that his cousin intended to marry a foreign woman with no standing, no protection, and no understanding of what that would cost the organization at the exact moment its leadership needed to look unshakable. He framed it as concern. It was underneath the opening move of the only plan he had left. Within hours, word reached Miho of two things at once. The council had scheduled an emergency vote on his fitness to lead, time to embarrass him before he could prepare a defense. And separately, quietly, men connected to Sango's own faction had been asking questions around Naomi's market, the kind of questions that come before something worse. Miho did the thing that frightened Naomi more than anything son he had ever said to her. He began to pull away. Not cruelly, carefully. He answered her calls a little slower. He found reasons the two of them should not be seen together in public for a while. He told himself, in the quiet hours he had never learned to share with anyone, that loving her from a distance was safer for her than loving her up close, and that this was a sacrifice, not a retreat. Naomi, who had spent her whole life reading rooms for the exact moment someone was about to leave her, felt the floor she had just started to trust begin, very quietly, to give way beneath her again. The night everything came apart, Miho was two places he needed to be at once, and there was no version of the evening that let him be in both. The council was meeting at 8 to vote on whether he remained fit to lead the family's interests. At the very same hour, 3 of Sango's men were making their way toward Naomi's storeroom, not to extort her this time, but to make a point sharp enough that word of it would reach every corner of the old families by morning, the point being that anything Miho Han loved could be reached. He did not deliberate. He walked out of the council chambers without a word to anyone, knowing exactly what that silence would cost him, and drove faster through that city than he had allowed himself to drive in 15 years. He reached her storeroom before the men did. What happened there does not need to be told in pieces. What matters is this. When it was finished, 2 of the 3 men would never trouble anyone in that market again, and the third was left alive, deliberately, breathing, terrified, and utterly clear on the message he was meant to carry back to whoever had sent him. Miho did not raise his voice once during any of it. Naomi, who arrived at her own storeroom minutes later to find him standing very still in the doorway, his knuckles marked, his breathing controlled in a way that frightened her more than if it had not been controlled at all, understood in that moment, completely and finally, exactly what kind of man had been quietly rearranging her life for the better without ever telling her why. She should have been afraid of him. Some small, sensible part of her was. But a larger part of her, the part that had spent her whole life being underestimated by people far gentler than this, looked at him standing in her doorway, having just chosen her over the entire structure of his own inherited world, and felt something that was not fear at all. "You missed the vote," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "They will use that against you." "Yes," he said again. And for the first time since she had known him, his voice, when it came, was not entirely steady. "I would miss it again." Which brings us back, finally, to the dining room where we began, to 30 guests, to a mother who had just said the cruelest sentence she knew how to say, believing, in the only way she had ever learned to love anyone, that cruelty now might spare Naomi something far worse later. To a door opening 3 minutes early. "Say that again," Miho had said. "I want to be sure I heard you." Now you understand everything sitting underneath that sentence. Sango was seated at the far end of the table that night, and it was no accident that he was. He had engineered this dinner deliberately, using Sonny's private doubts he had spent months quietly feeding with his own poison version of concern, to force a public rejection he was certain would weaken Miho in front of the very elders whose support he still needed. He had not expected Miho to walk in early. He had certainly not expected what came next. Miho did not raise his voice, not once, not through any of it, because he had never needed to. He laid it out for the room the way he laid out every decision he had ever made, plainly, without theater. He told them about the collector network. He told them about Jae-hoon, and what Jae-hoon had actually been trading information for. He told them who had funded the 3 men who came to Naomi's storeroom the night he missed the council vote, and the room went very still when the surviving man's account, gathered quietly in the days since, matched, detail for detail, everything Miho was now saying out loud in front of 30 witnesses. Near the door, Doyen Beck, who had spent 15 years standing quietly in rooms exactly like this one waiting for a night that finally made sense of all that waiting, allowed himself something very close to a smile. Sango's easy charm did not survive the telling. By the end of it, there was nowhere left in that room for him to stand. And then, in the same breath, without pause, without ceremony, Miho turned to his mother and to the family that had just watched him dismantle a betrayal 15 years in the making, and said the thing he had apparently been waiting his entire adult life for the right room to say out loud. "I intend to marry her," he said. "Not someday. Not quietly. I'm telling you now, in front of everyone you would have had witness her rejection, because I will not build a life with her in whispers the way this family has taught me to build everything else." The plot and the love story arrived, finally, at the exact same sentence because they had never actually been two different stories at all. Sunny did not apologize to Naomi that night, in front of everyone. That was not whose son he was, and this story would be lying to you if it pretended otherwise. She came to find her 3 days later, alone, in the small apartment that still smelled faintly of jollof rice and dye. She talked, haltingly, about a grave-outside soul she visited alone every year on a date she never told anyone. She talked about a 22-year-old girl with an accent everyone mocked, who had once believed that loving someone loudly was the same as painting a target on him. She did not say the word sorry. She placed, instead, the missing half of the woven bracelet she had given Naomi weeks earlier in her palm. A piece Naomi had not even known was missing, and closed Naomi's fingers around both halves at once. "I was not protecting my son from you, son," he said quietly. "I was protecting you from becoming me." What came after unfolded slowly, the way real happiness tends to, in moments too small to make headlines and too large to ever forget. There was an evening, months later, when Miho handed her a small velvet box that held not a ring, but a single cufflink, and when she looked closely at it she recognized, worked in gold, the exact pattern of the cowrie shells on the bracelet she had worn every day since her father died. He had been wearing its twin, he told her, quietly, tucked under his sleeve, for months, without telling her, because some things he had learned from her did not need to be announced to be true. There was a morning when she walked into a small, unfinished space near her old storeroom and found it already fitted with looms and shelving and a sign, not yet hung, that read her name and the word atelier beneath it, something she had mentioned once in passing, on a night she thought he had not really been listening. There was the proposal itself, which came exactly where you would expect it to, if you have been paying attention, in her storeroom, in the rain, under the same narrow awning where a man had once tilted an umbrella and left his own shoulder exposed rather than let her get wet. He did not kneel with a speech prepared. He simply took her hand, the one that wore her father's bracelet, and told her that he had spent his whole life being taught that wanting something out loud was the same as losing it, and that he was done being taught that. She said yes before he had technically finished asking. There was a trip back to Kumasi, the two of them together, where Naomi walked her fiancé through the rooms of her childhood, the market where she had once carried more than an 11-year-old should have had to carry, and watched her mother, finally, exhale a worry she had been holding silently since the year her husband died. And there was, years later, a Sunday morning that looked like nothing special and was everything. A kitchen that smelled of both their childhoods at once. Children in pajamas, arguing gently in two languages. Sunhee, older now, softer at the edges in a way no one who had known her 30 years earlier would have believed possible, teaching a granddaughter to fold dumplings at the counter while Efia's laugh carried in from the next room. And across that kitchen, over the noise of a whole loud, lived-in life, Naomi caught Miho's eyes for just a second longer than the moment required, the way she had once, in the rain, outside a customs office, and found the same thing waiting there that she had found that first day. Chosen, not despite anything. Chosen completely, on purpose, every single day since. That is where we leave them. Not because the story is over, but because some stories do not need an ending so much as they need a place quiet enough to finally rest. If this one found something in you, I would love to know what. Tell me in the comments what this story made you feel, who it made you think of, which moment between the two of them stayed with you longest. Was it the umbrella? Was it the doorway? Was it a mother finally putting down 30 years of fear so she could hold someone's hand instead? This has been Afro Korean Stories Empire, and if you take one thing with you tonight, let it be this. Love, the real kind, the kind that survives silence and distance, and every reason it was given to give up, is always, always worth the wait.